Who are you? You don't know. Don't tell me Negro, that's nothing. What were you before the white man named you a Negro? And where were you? And what did you have? What was yours? What language did you speak then? 20 million black people don't even know their own language. Why? Because he took it away from them. 20 million black people who don't even know the history of their ancestors. Why? Because he took it away from them. And if you try and tell them how thoroughly and completely they've been robbed, he says you're teaching hate. Got people who have been oppressed and exploited by those who are not their own kind, strangers. So the only way we're going to get some of this oppression and exploitation away from us or aside from us is come together against the common enemy. Aborigines, which means what? Black folks. You never find a white aborigine. Rather, aborigines are called natives, or they're always dark-skinned people. You and I are aborigines, but you don't like to be called an aborigine. You want to be called an American. Aborigine actually means from the beginning. It's two Latin words. Ab meaning from, origine meaning the beginning. Ab meaning from, origine meaning the beginning. Ab meaning from, origine meaning the beginning. Ab meaning from, origine meaning the beginning.
To watch all of my exclusive content not featured here on my channel, log on to my website at imjustheretomake.com/films. Now, in today's society of America, millions of so-called African Americans are struggling to come to grips with their true identity, culture, heritage, and history, mainly due to the numerous manipulative tactics utilized to govern their critical thinking mechanisms and to also decimate their literacy capabilities. Each one of these manipulative social engineering experiments can only be detected and detached from one's subconscious when standing outside of the box. I'll let you ponder on what's happening to those that are still inside of it. Meanwhile, you have not and will not ever hear me promote any form of religion throughout any of my content that I present to the public. Reason being is due to religion, faith, and beliefs being based on one's personal relationships. And I am not here to debate nor argue about who you should or should not love. That's simply none of my business. So let's also be sure to not confuse the truth that I present throughout my content with any personal beliefs that you may have. Now, in this segment, you will learn about who you truly are and where you really came from based on truthful information. Because mind you, there is a big difference between truth and facts. Facts are merely controversial information, whereas a person bears the opinion to debate its credibility or not. That's yet another form of belief. Whereas the truth is non-debatable due to its credibility of always making logical sense. This is why in today's society, most people don't even care about the truth. Why? Well, because to them, unfortunately, a lie is more entertaining So now let's start with March 1st, 1790, when then President George Washington and Vice President John Adams, along with Speaker of the House Frederick Muhlenberg, signed the 1790 Census Act. According to the census itself, it states that the 1790 Census Act is a law that, quote, required that every household be visited, that completed census schedules be posted in 2 of the most public places within each jurisdiction, there to remain for the inspection of all concerned, and that the aggregate amount of each description of persons for every district be transmitted to the president. So let me point out that some households, not all, were visited by these individuals entitled as census enumerators, also known as census takers, who are technically federal government unsupervised employees who allegedly went from town to town, city to city, and door to door, deciding who was of what race and then documented the family they meet as such. So you mean to tell me that these census takers were provided instructions by way of the government to document and record the ethnic category of various family members based on their perception of the family when they visited? And their opinions were considered to be official historical records of information? Even though they did not count every individual living within the United States due to the multiple indigenous Niji raids and rebellions occurring during this time period, the alleged first official census of the entire United States was implemented on a day dubbed as Census Day on August 2nd, 1790. See, now, what's very important to note here is that the, quote, free people of color were recorded all in one group, and also note that it states free and not freed, as if they were freed people from some form of enslavement. I go into more detail about the census labels in the documentary that I'll link above right now, but I said all of that for a particular reason, and that is the official 1790 U.S. Census population count was a total of 3,929,214 people. But keep in mind that this total amount did not reflect millions of people who were indigenous to North America, aka Turtle Island, meaning they did not come from another continent, nor did it reflect the accurate total amount of so-called slaves in North America. Why? Well, the U.S. Census Agency themselves admitted to not possessing the majority of their official historical records of information that was allegedly documented between the 1790 U.S. Census and all the way up to the 1830 U.S. Census. And their excuse was to claim that these records were lost or destroyed somehow. See, this was all purposely done for 2 reasons. A, to hide the truth about the real history surrounding the U.S. and slavery. I mean, generally speaking, you can literally prove to yourself that your ancestors were slaves or not by documentation. You can check and see if your ancestors came off a boat. I've been sharing this information publicly for years now, along with my sources. And I still have not heard from anyone that used my instructions to trace their family that I have available on Amazon Prime and anywhere else books are sold, that one of their ancestors were documented as being a former slave. The people that reached out to me that has or is currently undergoing research on their family's history have not failed with discovering that their family members were either never enslaved and has always been free, or worked as an indentured servant for money, land ownership, business ownership, etc., and considered to be freedmen once their obligations of servitude expired. Make no mistake, when you hear the term freedman from now on, freedman does not necessarily mean that he or she was freed from enslavement, because it can also mean relieved from their duties in most commonly known cases. So this first reason to allegedly lose or destroy these records was to hide the truth that it was a very small amount of copper-colored slaves and a greater amount of prisoners of war in North America. And the second reason is B, to hide the truth about who are the real minority and majority in terms of the population count here in the United States of America. In which this brings me to my very next point. The biggest portion of their agenda was the abominable sabotaging of the indigenous Niji's history, legacy, languages, culture, and heritage systematically. So of course they couldn't pull this task off on their own. So they implemented a methodology format based solely on the scientific concepts of eugenics. According to the National Archives, the term eugenics was coined by a British natural scientist and explorer named Francis Galton in the year of 1883. Now, there are two sides to every coin, so I'll be sure to flip each side over, and I'm not theoretically speaking here. Eugenics was implemented to help improve one selected group of people and their future generations to come, to overtake and oversee yet another set group of people and their future generations by way of extermination of their mindsets. This rabbit hole goes much deeper than one may assume. Allow me to simplify the explanation of this paramount method utilized by the likes of your industrialized institutions throughout America still to this very day. Eugenics literally changes everything that any person was ever taught of or even thought of previously before this selection was carried out upon him or her. According to Francis Galton himself, this system would allow, quote, more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable, end quote. Galton was heavily influenced by the likes of an English naturalist, biologist, and the first ever self-proclaimed documented bigoted genealogist, Charles Darwin. Darwin single-handedly developed the controversial theory of human evolution, which was his belief that man came from monkeys, and then his system of natural selection, which included a heavy flux of racial derogatory.
Since 1859, that's when Charles Darwin introduced Origin of Species by natural selection and the favored human races. Did you know that today they only report half the title that Charles Darwin wrote? His title had to do with favored human races, assigning supremacy to the Aryan race, all others being inferior. How many knew that? Only a handful. His book was racist, and that was the basic purpose for writing it.
During the early 1900s, the social engineering aspect of Darwin's theory became popular worldwide amongst many scientists alike, high-ranking politicians, and it even caught the eye of the elitists. More about this in the second installment concerning this topic, but I mention all of this to inform you that they played a prominent role in elevating the advancement of eugenics, specifically for the sake of their own race, disguised as if this was for the benefit of all humanity at a cost of whatever they desire. They were religiously following this formula or rule, dubbing it as survival of the fittest. In other words, Charles Darwin's theory of human evolution was merely a way to elevate and escalate the implementation of white supremacy, and to eradicate those who were of non-pale complexions, deeming it as survival of the fittest, where those who did not meet their racist criteria, motives, and agendas would suffer from a variety of forms of propaganda, that was hypothesized to eliminate the opposing race of people. Eugenics is literally a modernized pseudoscience that was based merely on racial discrimination and environmental injustice, socially, physically, and mentally, but became prosperous still due to its popularity of praises from those who gravitated towards inequality and racial estrangement. On the date of September 25, 2008, in a statement made before the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs by Representative James P. Morin, on the grounds of the Thomasina E. Jordan Indian Tribes of Virginia Federal Recognition Act, Morin stated, quote, "This is a travesty that this committee can correct. The second unique circumstance for the Virginia tribes is what they experienced at the hands of the state government during the first half of the 20th century. It has been called a paper genocide, at a time when the federal government granted Native Americans the right to vote. Virginia's elected officials adopted racially hostile laws targeted at those classes of people who did not fit into the dominant white society. The fact that some of Virginia's ruling elite claimed to be blood descendants of Pocahontas, in their view, meant that no one else in Virginia can make a claim they were Native American and a descendant of Pocahontas's people. To do so would mean that Virginia's ruling elite were what they decreed all non-whites to be, part of the inferior Negroid race. With great hypocrisy, Virginia's ruling elite pushed politics that culminated with the enactment of the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. This act directed state officials and zealots like Walter Plecker to destroy state and local courthouse records and reclassify in Orwellian fashion all non-whites as colored. It targeted Native Americans with a vengeance, denying Native Americans in Virginia their identity. To call yourself a Native American in Virginia was to risk a jail sentence of up to 1 year. End quote. Now, in this statement, he used the term Native American, but the truth is that our identities were changed not from Native American, but from Indian to colored. And they were not only jailing people in Virginia for claiming their true identity, but they were also killing them by hanging them from a tree, and in more ways than one that I won't mention, in each state across North America. The biggest bigoted, racist, white supremacist of them all was none other than Walter Ashby Plecker.
The Plecker era was truly one of the darkest times for Native people in Virginia. But I think it's critical for us to think about what was the genesis of the ideology that Plecker was a proponent of. And it's really the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement was a pseudo-scientific movement. We say pseudo-scientific today because we find that the science that they were proposing is not what we today would honor as scientific in any way. The eugenics movement has a direct link to the descendants of Charles Darwin. They somehow made the leap to these notions about racial purity. What is best for each race is racial purity. Plecker and his friends convinced the Virginia legislature to adopt very restrictive legislation in 1924. It's called the Racial Integrity Act. With this legislation, it was decreed that there were only two possible categories. One is white, which means a person you check that you're white if you have white ancestry, Caucasian ancestry, and absolutely nothing else. The other category is everybody else, and that's colored. So this was very hard on Virginia's indigenous community because in a sense it wipes away their identity. Their identity on paper, their ability to describe themselves as Indian was not possible. To describe themselves as Indian was not possible.
Keep in mind that our elder family members' birth certificates were changed multiple times to state colored, Negro, mulatto, and now Black or African American as their classifications of racial identity by way of the federal government systematically. So the moral of this segment is that you have been lied to by your government, your president and politicians, your news media, your school teachers, college and university professors, your public school history curriculums, multiple out of Africa theory books, and even by the very people that share the same hue as you and I. And that's a whole nother story within itself. Now, I challenge each and every one of you to seriously research your mother or your grandmother or your great-grandmother's birth certificates right now. And if it has the letter C or COL dot or colored and every other misclassified title of race created by the government that I just mentioned, then at that moment, you will know the absolute truth about who you really are. I'm just here to make you think.